Today's stuff we're going to be learning is Gittin Daf Lamed Aleph. Today's talk is sponsored by Hope Perry in honor of Catherine Bellity. Thank you for inspiring my learning, and my neshama always much love. Before we start, I just want to announce, you might have seen already that we're planning a Hadran Daf Yomi trip to Poland in the end of October to the beginning of November. It'll be from Sunday to Thursday, and the end of it is going to be at the Yeshiva Chochmei Lublin, which was started by Rav Meir Shapiro, who started Daf Yomi, and it'll be right around the 100th year anniversary, which will be Rosh Hashanah, so it'll be very exciting that we'll be there in the 100th year. And the siyum for everybody, the one on Zoom, will be from there. So everybody, even if you can't come, you'll be able to be part of the siyum in Poland. It'll be very exciting, and hope you can join, whoever is able to join. There's only about 40 spots, so that the trip doesn't get to be too big a group. So register and sign up. And if you don't make it to come this time, there will be other opportunities, God willing. Hopefully this will be a successful trip and we'll be able to do it. I don't know how often, but we will be able to run it once in a while. And so if you can't make it this time, don't worry. Okay, let's get started. We're in the middle of a sugi here, and we're actually today going to finish the third chapter. And the fourth chapter, which is coming up, is all about tikkun ha'olam. The fourth and the fifth chapter gets into all sorts of takanot the rabbis instituted to prevent. We're going to start with aguna issues and other possible issues relating to women and marriage. And then from there, we're going to get to all sorts of other takanot. And it's fascinating 2 chapters. If you're not already, Gittin is pretty fascinating in terms of all the topics we've covered, whether messengers and how someone could do something for somebody else, which is actually what we're going to start with today. What can you actually take teruma for the Levite? And so you already see Gittin is full of all sorts of interesting issues, not just marriage issues and divorce, but also dine mamonot, right? Issues between people and somebody doing something for someone else, or all sorts of other kind of issues. So from here, we're going to get off into all sorts of other issues. Anyone, by the way, who's interested in more content on it, if you recall, we had last year, we had our course on tikkun ha'olam, which was all about these types of sugyot, where we went in depth into 4 sugyot from the 4th chapter. So on our courses, the courses section of our website, you can take a free course on, go in depth into 4 of the topics that we're going to learn coming up. That's all intro. Now we're going to get started with our topic. We started with, we had a braita about someone having maaser in their house of the Levites. They hadn't get given it to him, and it wasn't clear whose it was and what was going on. And if there was a measurement, then we said, we're worried there might have been teruma maaser or something about teruma maaser. And if there wasn't a measurement given, then there was no concern about teruma maaser. We weren't sure really what this meant. We brought 2 possibilities, rejected both possibilities, and then we ended with explaining that the issue is the father had written in the will and had left to the son, who's now the one who's dealing with it. Father is no longer here. It said, I have X amount of maaser, or just I have maaser of someone in my property. And if it was specified how much, we can assume that the father must have separated the teruma from the maaser already, which is really an obligation on the Levi, but we can assume the father did it. If there was no measurement specified, then since it has to be a particular amount, which is a tenth, we don't assume that the maaser was taken, the teruma was taken. To which the Gemara had asked, and this is where we left off, can the owner of the produce take the teruma maaser for the Levite? Isn't it an obligation on the Levite himself? To which they answered, he actually can, according to Abba Elazar ben Gamli. Okay, there is an opinion that says one can do this. What's it based on? Okay, we're starting from the bottom of Lamed Amud Bet. Ditanya, Abba Elazar ben Gamla Omer, v'nechshav lachem trumatchem. Okay, this is from Parsha Korach, which for some of us, it's the Parsha for this week, for some of us next week. Nechshav lachem trumatchem, you'll see when you follow in the Parsha that it's in the category where it's talking about the Levites, and that the Levites have to also separate teruma, right? In addition to the owner. Let's just go through the rules again. The owner takes 1/50 of his produce, or he could take 1/40 or 1/60, depending on whether he wants to be generous or not. That's the range given for teruma gedolah. That goes to the Kohen. After he separates that out, then he separates 1/10 to the Levite. Then the Levite separates from the 10th that he gets, separates another tenth to give to the Kohen. So because it says nichshav lachem trumatchem, they say b'shtei trumot hakatuv medaber. There's two mentions of truma here, and that's because the pasuk continues and says kidagam min agoren, like taking the dagam from the storage house. They say this seems, Rashi says that's where we get two things here. The one is truma gdola and one is truma maaser. Echad truma gdola, echad truma maaser. Kashem shetruma gdola, so truma gdola is with the 150th, 140th, 160th that you take from the produce first, and then the truma maaser is what the Levite takes. So since they're both referenced in the pasuk, again, it's not 100% clear where it references to trumot, but they seem to say there's a reference to two trumot in the pasuk. Kashem shetruma gdola nitelet ba'omed uba'machshava. So since there's these two trumot mentioned in the pasuk, we're going to do what's called a hekesh. Since they're both mentioned in the same verse, we're going to learn from one to the other. So in this case, we're going to learn from the regular truma to the truma maaser. So just like truma gdola, first we're not going to talk about our topic, we'll get to our topic in a minute, is taken be'omed. You can just estimate it. You don't have to measure exactly. U'b'machshava, and you don't have to actually physically, you do eventually have to actually physically separate it. But if I'm standing here and I have a pile of my produce and I say the part on the left from, the second one over, or I designate it in my head, is going to be truma. Okay, and anytime they say machshava, it's always a debate. Does it mean I actually have to express it in words, or is it enough that it just stays in my thoughts? That's a debate. But I can do it, meaning as soon as I say that, those have the status of truma upon them. Obviously, I haven't finished. I haven't given it to the Kohen. At some point, I have to physically separate it and give it to the Kohen. But at that moment, it has the sanctity of truma on it, just by my thinking about it, or maybe expressing it in words, but not actually physically doing anything. So these are two things that are true about truma gdola, and kach truma maaser nitelet ba'omed u'b'machshava. Same thing about the truma maaser. Now there's something a little bit strange about this, because truma maaser, we already said, truma gdola is a range between 140th to 160th, which makes sense. I could just estimate because I have a big range of what I can do. But the truma maaser is exactly a tenth. So how can I estimate? So some people say what we mean is we can estimate up. I can always give more than a tenth. So I don't have to measure it exactly. It's exactly a tenth. I can just estimate as long as I at least have a tenth in there. Ukeshem. Now here's the second thing we're going to learn. Keshem sheyesh lo reshut lebal habayit litrom truma gdola. That's how we do truma gdola. The owner of the produce is the one who determines the regular truma. Yesh lo reshut lebal habayit litrom truma maaser. Likewise, the owner can also take the truma maaser out of the lady's portion. So again, I separate my truma gdola, then I separate my maaser, and then I put aside my stuff for the Levi, and from that, I can actually take the truma maaser. And that's exactly how we understood the Braita, that we can assume that if it's a chaver and there was a set measurement, then basically you could take the truma maaser for the Levi. Okay, so now it doesn't contradict what we said yesterday about the exact amount, because the assumption is if there was an amount specified, then we can assume maybe. Also, it's a little unclear if he wrote it in his will, what does that have to do with it? Maybe the father knew the amount specified, but I think if he specified the amount, he was telling us this because he was trying to say, and because I knew the exact amount, I was able to take the truma from it. But this is saying you can, if you want to take it ba'omed. I think there it's more reflecting what people normally did, that they didn't necessarily take it ba'omed, but they did measure. I agree with you, Becky, with your question. There's a little bit of a question here, how this works with the other one, because we did just say, it's all measured exactly, and only when you know the exact measurements can we assume. But it's more making assumptions about if he gave us exact measurements, then we could assume it was all measured exactly, and then from that he figured out how much maaser he needed to take and actually took, how much truma he needed to take and actually took it. But you're right, it's a little bit tricky. Okay, new Mishnah. We're continuing along, and last Mishnah of our chapter is again about presumption of something being still alive, or in this case, it's not going to be something living. It's going to be produce that hasn't gotten rotten or money that hasn't disappeared. So, and we're continuing along the theme of the truma maaser, which we were dealing. Generally, I take in my produce from the field, I take it, I make a pile, right? I bring it in the house, and then I separate. I say, this is truma, this is maaser, blah, blah, blah. And then this is maaser sheni. Maaser sheni, then I would, while I take the maaser sheni, I then immediately redeem it on a coin, and then right, that's how I have to redeem the value plus another fifth. That's the way you do that. But There's another way to do it. Now, this isn't an ideal way, and we've talked already that you can't do truma shalom and amukaf. You're not supposed to take truma if all the produce isn't really in front of you. This mission is discussing a case where I did do that, okay? And they try to grapple with how could this be, and is this forbidden, or is it just not recommended? But in any case, we're just assuming this is a fact on the ground that someone could do this. I basically picked a whole bunch of, I have a bunch of produce that I brought in from my field, and I leave a pile on the side. And I say, just to make it easier for myself, every time I bring in produce, I'm going to say that from this pile, I'm going to separate my teruma and maaser. So basically, I come in, let's say on the beginning of January, maybe that's not a good time, not agriculturally, but I'm giving a random date. I put a big pile of produce on the side in January. Now, I come on January in the first week and I pick some produce. And then I say, I have this big pile. I'm going to take, a certain percentage of that pile right now will be teruma. And then the next week I could bring in my produce and I say, now this next percentage of that pile is going to be teruma. And I keep doing it until my pile is full and the whole thing is teruma. And then I take it and bring it to the Kohen. It's like a bit of an easier way to do it. Again, there are some halachic issues. It's not min hamukaf, it's not all together, and it's not in front of me, which we're going to see. But let's say I did it this way. However, whether it was allowed, not allowed, but I did it, or it's not ideal. Or ma'ot, so I left fruits, okay, fruits just means produce, on the side. Or ma'ot, by the way, just to be clear, it has to be, I have to have different types here, because everything that I bring in from a field, I need to take teruma from that. Like if it's lemons, it needs to be lemons. If it's wheat, it needs to be wheat. So maybe I have a few piles here of different types of produce. Ma'ot liyom mafrisha lehem maaser sheni. I have a pile of money, and little by little, this is what we do in our house, right? We basically always have to redeem from our fruit trees the maaser sheni. So I put a coin aside, and I don't have to check every time that the coin is there. I can just assume the coin is there. Okay, so I can do that. I can put money on the side for my maaser sheni, for my redemption of my maaser sheni fruits. And then I can just assume that they're there. I don't have to check every time that the fruit hasn't rotten, or the produce hasn't become rotten, or someone took it, or the money disappeared. Okay? Im avdu, but what if I look one day at my big pile and I say, I don't believe it. They're rotten entirely. Or I go to look for the money and the money is gone. This has happened to me, by the way, with my maaser sheni money. I have it like taped in the closet and somehow the tape fell off, the money fell down, and someone, I don't know what they did with it, but it does happen. So now what happens? What do you do in that situation? This might remind you of the beginning of Masechet Nida, if anyone remembers learning it, where if you all of a sudden see that you've gotten your period, what do? How far back do you have to go when it comes to if you were in contact with vessels that are supposed to be that you keep b'tahara in a state of purity? Right, nowadays we don't have this anymore, but how far back do you have to go and assume that you were impure before? Okay, and you just didn't know. So there's a whole debate what we do about this. So anyway, one of the opinions there is you go back 24 hours. So we basically say the last 24 hours, at least that's how we're going to understand the Mishnah right now. We're going to suggest another reading later, but made late is always 24 hours. So you go back and say, anything I did, we assume it must have got rotted in the last 24 hours. So you go back, any produce that you did the tithes on in the last 24 hours, you have to redo basically, because they're not tithed produce. Divrei Rabbi Elazar. This is just Rabbi Elazar. We're going to see later in the Gemara that the rabbis disagree. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Vishlosha prakim bodkim et hayayin. If you separated wine for the purposes of taking teruma and maaser, you have your wine there so that when you bring in grapes from the field or you have other wine, you're going to separate from the wine on the wine. So actually, now remember, I think an issue came up. Can you use wine to separate on grapes? I don't remember actually what we answered, but let's just assume you have other wine and you're going to take the teruma from the wine on the wine. So then there's an expectation. And from here, we're going to get on a whole track about the weather and the different winds. That's how we're going to end our chapter in a very kind of strange manner, because you'll find the Gemara is somewhat strange. There's 3 times of the year where we check the wine. because there's a good chance that the wine spoils these times of year due to the weather changes. Because once the wine turns into vinegar, well, you can't use it to separate your teruma maaser on your wine. B'kidum shamotzei chag. And this is what's going to get us sidetracked. On the eastern wind that comes after Chag Sukkot. Okay, after Sukkot, this is really around the autumnal equinox. And basically, that's going to bring this hot wind, which basically ends up, right, hot winds often cause stuff to rot. Ubahotzat smadal, also the time of year when the fruits fall off the vine and the little bud comes out. Ubashat knisat mayim bebosem, and when the grapes get juicy enough that you could get a little bit of liquid out of them, also that's a time of year. So these are different times of year when there's weather change and it causes the wine to possibly spoil. At that point, you actually have to check. You have to make sure before I use my wine, I have to check to make sure. And yes, if you took the teruma maaser and then it turned out you hadn't and the stuff was rotten, then what you did was actually tevel. So that's why it needs to be fixed again. So now the Gemara says, "My made late." What are we talking about? 24 hours from when? So we already explained the way Rabbi Yochanan explains. Rabbi Yochanan Amar made late shel b'dika, which is, by the way, the same use of made late when it comes to the woman when she checks and sees that she's menstruating. So she goes 24 hours back and says, anything I touch in the last 24 hours is going to be a problem. By the way, when we discussed it there, those who learn with us, you might remember, and well, it's the same issue here, which is realistically, this is a little bit of a problem. Like, does the woman remember exactly what vessel she was in contact with in the last 24 hours? Does the person here remember which produce, right? Like, let's say I brought in produce and then I mixed it with the produce that was already, the reality of this is a very complicated, sticky situation, which makes sense, at least that Rabbi Yochanan says it's only 24 hours back. Wait till you hear the second opinion. It seems impossible to figure out how to do this. Rabbi Elazar ben Antigenu Somiel Mishum Rabbi Elazar Rabbi Yanai. This Rabbi Elazar ben, someone said in the name of a different Rabbi Elazar. We're going to have a lot of Rabbi Elazars in the next minute or two. Me'et la'et, we're now moving to Amud Bet. Me'et la'et shel hanacha. You have to go back 24 hours, till 24 hours after you put the produce down. So basically, you have to go all the way back. You have to assume, basically the assumption is, the produce was good when you put it in the pile, and the money was there when you put it down. You can assume it's there only for 24 hours. After 24 hours, the produce could have rotted, the money could have been gone, and all you get is 24 hours. And then try to figure out how to go back and fix all the produce. I mean, forget that you've eaten stuff already, but even the stuff you didn't eat, what was before, what was after, it's quite confusing. They don't really discuss the reality and how you do this. What they're really just discussing is what are the technicalities of it in terms of what are the assumptions we make. That's what this is all about, this chapter, making assumptions about, are people alive, are people dead, are people, right? What kind of assumptions can we make? And again, this is always using what we can assume. Okay, so this is a bit of a different approach about how quickly things spoil. Obviously, it really depends also on what kind of things, right? Like I have a basket of fruits in my kitchen, and there's certain fruits I know that if I don't check them every day, by the time I get back there, they're going to be rotten, whereas other fruits might last a long time. So it's here they're trying to give blanket rules, even though we know that different produce has a different amount of time that it might last. Now they're going to bring a question to the second opinion here. Look at the language of the Mishnah. If they got lost, we go back 24 hours. Now, we're concerned for 24 hours. So now, which one does this more likely mean? It says that makes a lot of sense. That's why we explained it that way. You are concerned for the last 24 hours. If we're saying you have to go all the way back to the beginning, why should it say made late? It should be until 24 hours. In other words, what it's saying is you go back and are concerned for all this produce up until 24 hours from when you put it there. So it should say the words ad, up till, because you're basically going all the way back until you get to 24 hours from the time it was put down. So the Gemara says, yeah, kasha. In fact, you're right. It really doesn't make a lot of sense, that opinion. Now we're going to go back to divrei Rabbi Elazar, and he's the one who said 24 hours. So now Amal, I told you we're going to have a lot of Rabbi Elazars. Amal Rabbi Elazar the Amora, The Amora Rabbi Elazar is now referring back to the Tana Rabbi Elazar. It's always confusing when Rabbi Elazar talks about Rabbi Elazar. Halukim alav chaberav al Rabbi Elazar. He says, we want you to know the rabbis disagree with him. Okay, even though it wasn't mentioned in the Mishnah, the rabbis think that everything is messed up, basically. And on what basis? We don't have this 24-hour, where all you have to do is go back 24 hours, or maybe you at least get the first 24 hours. No, nothing. We assume you knew it was, you put it down. If you did teruma right then, you're good. After that, you have to assume the money got lost, the fruits got rotted, and you have to start from scratch and redo everything. How do we know this? He says, Ditnan, it says in a Mishnah, and now it's a different topic, but it's a mikvah. Mikvah shenindad v'nimtza chaser. You had a mikvah, okay, let's say the person comes to check the mikvah, everything's good, and then they come back a week later and they check the mikvah, right? I'm thinking of those elevators where they always say when it was last checked, right? It was checked, on this day, it was checked on this day. So, the mikvah also gets checked periodically. So they check the mikvah, everything was fine. And then they check it, let's say a week later. And it turns out the mikvah didn't have enough water in it. So now, again, how far back do you go? So kol taharot shenasu al gabav lemafreya, all the taharot that were done there, lemafreya, you go all the way back. Bein bereshut hayechi, bein bereshut harabim, tmeot. Everything, it doesn't matter if it was in the public domain, it doesn't matter if it was in the private domain, it's all impure. What was in the public domain? What was in the private domain? And why are we mentioning public-private? Well, you might remember that we talked when we learned about sota, and we've learned this a number of times already, that anything that's we're suspicious, maybe it became impure. We're not sure. There's a suffix, there's a doubt about it. If the item was found in the public domain, we assume it's fine. If it was found in the private domain, we assume it's impure. And that's all learned out from the sota, where she has a doubt about her status. If she's, and the Torah calls it tameh and tahol, even though it's not the same purity and impurity. But from there, we learn that since the sota is only suspected if she was alone in the room with a man, so we learn from there to choma that it's only a problem when it's in a private domain. First of all, that's how it's learned. And also it's an easy way to remember. If you get confused, which one is which, you always remember, think about the sota. The sota is obviously in a closed room. So now it's unclear, this whole debate about what was in Rishut Yachi, what was in Rishut Arbim, the mikvah or the objects now, it's not clear. But anyway, it doesn't really matter in this case. Because what's the issue here? The issue is you really have no idea if the mikvah had enough water. So basically, you have to go back and say everything that was done until then is tameh. Okay, it doesn't talk here, I see your question. It doesn't talk here about what happens with a woman who was in the mikvah and then had relations with her husband. Right? Obviously, we would call that shogeg. It's just a question, would she have to go to the mikveh again? And probably they would say, yes, go to the mikveh again now that you know. To which they say, so comes Rabbi Elazar and he says, look, you see from this Mishnah, the rabbis totally disagree. Because they go back, it says, lemafreya, all the way back to the beginning. In other words, from the last time the mikveh was checked, from then on, you have to assume it didn't have enough water. To which the Gemara says, Rabbi Elazar, why are you telling us this? Pshita de chalukim. It's obvious. You didn't need to bring us this Mishnah. In other words, you brought us this Mishnah, but we know Mishnayot, and it's clear that the rabbis disagree. So why are you telling us this? To which the Gemara answers, that the question was on Rabbi Elazar, but probably they didn't ask him directly. It was more a question that came up later. You might have thought lemafreya means when he says it goes back to the beginning, maybe it doesn't really mean the beginning. Lemafreya is just retroactive. Retroactive doesn't necessarily mean all the way back. It just means go backwards somewhat. Maybe you meant me'et la'et. Maybe it's only 24 hours backwards. Kamashmanan, therefore, comes teachers, no. The rabbis actually hold you go all the way back and everything has to be redone. Again, this is really complicated to figure out how they did this in a real way, because who's going to figure out what vessels were in this mikvah on what day, and do people keep track of that? But you basically have to go back to the last time the mikvah was checked. Okay, whereas Rabbi Elazar only says 24 hours back. Now we're going to get to the weather. So Rabbi Yehuda Omer b'shlosha prakim. So the first thing we're going to say is Tana b'kidum shel motzei chag shel tkufa. When it talked about the kidum of the motzei chag, they want you to know we're talking about the equinox and we're talking about the autumn. We're talking about Sukkot, basically. In case you thought chag meant something else, we're talking about Sukkot and that eastern hot wind that comes in. Tana. Rabbi Yehuda Omer. Before we get all the way into the weather, we're going to have two other braita, or one braita that mentions two other things about 3 times a year. Okay, different issue. And then we're going to figure out what's the point of this. Why are they telling us this? Is it just for, business reasons, giving us business advice, which you could say, okay, they give us medical advice, maybe they give us business advice. Sometimes the Gemara does have that. But then they're going to say there is a relevant halachic issue that comes out of it. So Tanya Rabbi Yehuda Omer, there's 3 times of year where you should sell your grains because the prices are always high this time of year. Why are the prices high? Simple, there's more demand. We'll see why in a minute. Lifnei hazera, before the planting season, because people need seeds. Where are they going to get seeds from? From the grains. Ubishat hazera, and while they're planting, ubifrosa Pesach, and 2 weeks before Pesach, because that's when the wheat is all grown. Ubishlosha prakim, so in that, right, those times of year, that's when, Pesach is because they want it to make their matzah. Okay, people all need grains to make matzah, because, normally you need bread, but this is like the mitzvah of matzah, everybody's doing that. So they're going to need it. So there's a big demand. So when the demand goes up, right, this is, you all know, right, the price of matzah before Pesach is probably higher than the price of matzah during the year. I've never tried to buy matzah during the year, but I imagine it doesn't cost as much, right? We'll get to, in a minute, the price of wine. And, I know certainly I go into the fruit store, which is where you see the most fluctuation of price. And always just before the holiday, the prices are jacked up in Israel. When it's around the Jewish holidays, everybody's going shopping and the prices all go up. So 3 times a year, and this really connects with the thing here. Bifrosa Pesach, bifrosa Atzeret, ubifrosa Chag. Okay, 2 weeks before Pesach, 2 weeks before Shavuot, and 2 weeks before Sukkot, because everybody wants wine for the holiday. So the price of wine used to go up then. The shemen and the oil, maaser ve'elach. That season where there's a high demand is from Shavuot and beyond. Okay, why that is, I'm not really sure. Okay, now the Gemara says, Lemai hilchata, why are you telling us this? Okay, so prices are high. So if you're a seller, you should go sell your stuff. That's financial advice. That's just wise, right? Don't sell it 2 weeks before when the prices are low because the price is going to go up, right? This is like, how the dollar rate fluctuates or the shekel rate, right? And when's a good time to sell? You can anticipate, no one really knows, right? But in this case, you can anticipate when the prices are going to go up, so you should wait. But the Gemara says, there must be some halachic ramification, otherwise they wouldn't be telling us this. Amar Rava v'Tema Rav Papi, the Rava, Rav Papa said this, lishutafim. If you have a partner and you go to sell your shared items, well, you might sell it, and then your partner, you'll come home and say, look, I made all this money, and then the partner will say, why'd you sell it at that price? We could have gotten a much better price. So when you have a partner, you have to check with them the prices, but not if you're in this season, because in this season the prices are so high that there's no way your partner is going to have some issue with the price that you sold it for. So therefore, if it's that season, you don't have to take advice from that person. Mikam ve'elach mai. What about beyond that? So they seem to be giving you like a particular date, 2 weeks before Pesach. What about after that? So Amarava kol Yomi pirkahu. In other words, from that time and on, it means. Obviously, there's an end date, but basically that whole period of time. Now we're going to start with this eastern wind that was mentioned in the Mishnah as spoiling the wine, this hot eastern wind. Okay, we've been having very weird weather patterns, both in Israel and other places of the world, and it's hard to not think about that when you talk about these winds and these hot winds and destroying things. So, Vayhi kizroach hashemesh vayiman Elohim ruach kadim charishi. We're now in the 4th chapter of Sefer Yonah, the last chapter, when God brings this heat, and then Yonah gets very hot and uncomfortable, and then God creates this kikayon, which protects him from the heat. Anyway, he has this very hot heat. It says, Vayiman Elohim ruach kadim charishi. He calls it this eastern wind, charishit. What is charishit? My charishit, Am Rav Yehuda, b'sha'a shemenashevet osa tlamim bayam. Comes from lachrosh. Lachrosh is to plow. So it's such a strong wind that it makes furrows in the water when it blows. Amar le Rabbi, hachi hanu tichtiv, vatach hashemesh al rosh Yonah v'yitaleh. So now, what does this have to do with it? So Rashi says, it's talking about how the world is full of heat. HaKatuv ba laha'id, nitchamem ha'olam, va'ata omer shesiper HaKatuv b'kof v'rat tzaroteh. In other words, it doesn't make any sense. They're talking about how hot the world came. It wasn't coming to say how much it created furrows in the water. That wasn't what the idea was. So it should have then talked about the water or the furrows it created and how strong it was. This is really talking about the heat of it. So El Amaraba b'sha'ah shemenashevet meshateket kol harucha mipaneh. Why does it create heat? Because it stops all the other winds from blowing. That's what it does. Teresh, from like it deafens all the other winds, causes them to stop entirely. There's a pasuk from Eov, says your clothes are hot because it was silenced, the land was silenced from the south. In other words, from the south winds, it stopped, the eastern winds must have come and silenced and there you see the word hashket, silence the south winds. Okay, so this is a very hot wind that comes and basically silences all the other winds, and that's why it's so hot, because it stops the other winds from blowing. He explains this how we just got from this pasuk. When are your clothes hot? Because and it silences all those words. Rav Huna and Rav Chisda havu yatve. Rav Huna and Rav Chisda were sitting. Geneiva. Okay, we talked about Geneiva. Shuli Mishkan Dardav flashback went up this week about Geneiva. Okay, so now they're sitting with Geneiva. Geneiva was a controversial character. Shuli brings up in her article some other an academic approach to try to fill in this Geneiva story with some evidence and attempt to try to figure out who exactly he was and what exactly the story was with him. Anyway, it's a very interesting, tricky character. He was both a Talmid Chacham, but also, and he comes up a crazy amount of times in Masechet Gittin, so definitely a worthwhile read, particularly because we're in Masechet Gittin, and his name came up already a few times. It's going to come up a few more. They were sitting in Geneiva comes right there. Amar chad l'chavre, nekom mikame. One says to the other, let's get up and out of respect for him. We're going to have this exact story also later on in the Masechet. It's just the first part is the same. The second part is going to be different. They're going to kind of hone in on different things that happened in this same, seems like it must have been the same meeting up of them, but there it went in one direction, here it goes in a different direction. So one says, let's get up and respect him, Gebar Oryan, who's a Ben Torah. The other one said, what, we're going to get up in front of such a controversial character? In other words, okay, it might be a Talmid Chacham, but he was a very tricky character in Brachot. He had this whole thing with Mar Ukva. Wasn't exactly clear what went on there, but he's a controversial guy. He's very feisty. He's always fighting with people. He's not exactly causes fighting and stuff. I don't need to get up and respect him. In the meantime, instead of them going to greet him, he shows up by them. He says, what are you talking about? We're talking about the weather. Okay, we're talking about the winds. Could be just right. Change the subject. They didn't want to continue their conversation. They just say, oh, we're talking about the weather, right? That's your always default. But anyway, they say, we're talking about the winds. He says to them, oh, you're talking about the winds. I'll tell you some things about the winds. There's 4 winds that blow every day. And that one's always going. The north wind, if it weren't for the north wind, that one seems to probably calm the other winds, and that's kind of the cooling wind that cools things down. It's interesting. You would have thought winds are dangerous because of the cold, but really the winds are dangerous because of the heat winds and the hot winds. And living in a country where we have sandstorms and hot winds coming, you can understand. So basically the north wind, which cools things down, that's the one that basically makes the world survive. If it weren't for that wind, the world wouldn't survive even 1 hour. The hardest of all, though, the most dangerous is the southern wind. If it weren't for Benetz, who's a type of angel, who basically holds back the south wind, the whole world would be destroyed. How do we know this? Another pasuk from Eov. Makes sense for quoting Eov because Eov talks about kind of how the world works. From your wisdom, the netz soars. Yifros knafav l'teman, and he stretches his wings out all the way to Teman. Teman is the south. So he goes to he stretches his wings to the south to prevent the south wind from destroying the world. Another story, similar structure. We have right there were 2 people, and then Geneiva shows up on the scene, and there's a bit of a split about one wants to go to him, the other one doesn't. We're going to have the exact same structure here, but a little bit different. Rava and Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, the 2 of them were sitting. Rav Nachman bar Yaakov. Okay, then Rav Nachman bar Yaakov comes by. But it's a little bit different. He's sitting in a golden chariot. And he's wearing this big cloak that's tchelet, this blue, beautiful blue color. So Rava goes out to greet him. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak lo azal gabe. He doesn't go out to greet him. Why doesn't he go out to greet him? He doesn't identify who it is. He just sees a guy in a big golden chariot with this big cloak of tchelet on him, and he says, this is probably one of the Reish Galuta's people. He looks like one of these wealthy people that I want to have nothing to do with. The Reish Galuta was the exilarch. And there's always stories in the Gemara. Some are very positive about the Reish Galuta, and some are very negative. In fact, we're going to get to some more in Gittin further on about some really negative stories. Rav Sheshet always gets into altercations with the Reish Galuta's people. We're going to have a famous story there. Anyway, they're not exactly always the best of people. They sometimes have thugs that, bully people. And he said, he looks like one of those wealthy Reish Galuta people. And I don't want to have I don't need to go say hello to him, which is similar to the Geneiva. The Geneiva, at least they identified and said, we don't want to, one said yes, one said no. Here, he says, it doesn't look like a good thing here. I don't need to go to him. And then he even says further, Rava needs them. I don't need these guys. Maybe Rava wasn't as wealthy and needed to be connected with the wealthy people. And he was saying, I'm wealthy enough. I don't need them. Or whatever reason he thinks that Rava might need, these were kind of people that you either need them or you don't need them, right? You might be they're people who are helpful in certain situations, or you have to be nice to them because otherwise they might be mean to you. Anyway, he didn't think that he needed this whole thing. So he kind of said, I'll just stay away from him. Now what happens? But then as he got closer, he identified him as Rav Nachman bar Yaakov. And then he realized it wasn't these thugs of the Reish Galuta or people he didn't want to have anyone to do with, but it was actually Rav Nachman bar Yaakov. So he goes to greet him. And at that moment, the east wind blows, and all of a sudden, Rav Nachman bar Yaakov's sleeves were revealed, his arms were revealed. His cloak blew up, and you could see his arms. What the significance is, I don't really know, but they're going to start talking about the weather because of it. Okay, right? You're in this moment where there's crazy weather, and that's what everybody's going to be talking about. Amal Shadya Nashim, he said, wow, the wind is blowing here. Amarava, so this east wind is blowing, and now they start to say, Rava says, Hachi Amarav, this is what I heard Rav say about this, Ishama Pelepo. This wind is so strong, it causes women to miscarry. Ushmuel Amar, Afilo Margalit Shabayam Merakevet Bo. Shmuel says this wind is so strong, it could even rot the pearls in the sea. Rabbi Yochanan Amar, Afilo Shekbat Zera Shabeme'ei Isha Maslechet Bo. A woman is about to get impregnated, and even if the semen is in her body, it causes it to rot. This is a little bit similar to the wine spoiling, right? They're now talking about all sorts of things that happen because of weather. Again, this is probably a way of, first of all, the women miscarrying is something that comes up in all different places, because it was something that, or women dying in childbirth is another one where the rabbis didn't understand why these things happen. So they start to give reasons, right? They start to try to come up with, right? Sometimes it's reasons like, okay, people must have sinned and that's why it happened, even though, right, we don't generally play God, but it's just a way that they can sort of try to grapple with it. And then there's also the approach of saying there must be some weather pattern or something that caused this to happen. The same way wine might flow from it, it might also cause other things to happen as a result. So now we're going to have, so I will stop for a minute because I see what you're writing. There's actually a debate about which Rav Nachman this was, and one of them is the Reish Galuta's son-in-law. He was married to Yalta. If you remember, Yalta's the Reish Galuta's, and he's always the rabbi of the Reish Galuta. So it seems like usually Rav Nachman comes without a surname, a bar something. But when he's with someone else, so he has a name, but there's a bit of a debate about which Rav Nachman is which. But probably the one in the chariot was the one who was, the Rav Nachman, the wealthy one who was married to the Reish Galuta's daughter. Okay, in any case, so now we continue. So these are three possibilities, and now comes Amar Rav Nachman, and I have in brackets Bar Yitzchak. Also, it was a little deliberation which Rav Nachman's talking here. It obviously confused everybody, this whole two Rav Nachmans. Ushloshtam mikra chad darshu. They all darshan this from the same pasuk. Okay, probably Rav Nachman bar Yaakov was the one who started talking about these winds. He was the one in the chariot, and then it seems like the other Rav Nachman is piping in and saying, oh, well, these were all learned out from the same verse. Tihu ben achim yafli. This is a pasuk from Hosea. Yavo kadim ruach Hashem mimidbar oleh. Okay, in other words, he will be between the brothers. He will be fruitful. It will come, this wind, this ruach kadim from the east will come from the ruach of God. Mimidbar oleh, it rises from the desert. V'yevosh mikoro, will dry up the makor, the source. Yecherav mayano, it will dry up the stream. Hu yishse otzar kol klechem dan, it will destroy the treasures, where all the protected things are safe. So now we're going to go through one by one. Yevosh mikoro is the makora shalisha. The word for uterus of the woman is actually makor. Okay, so it's going to basically dry up and cause her to miscarry. Yecherav mayano, zera shebemei isha. This is the semen. It's like a stream. And hu yishsek otzar kol klechem dan zomer galit shebayam. Okay, this is showing all the strengths of these three things that it will cause are all learned out from this pasuk. Amarava adis sura'ahu didai kekra says, wow. This Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, he comes from Surah and he really knows his stuff, right? Those people from Surah, they really know how to learn psukim, and that's how we knew to connect it to this pasuk. Mikey hu ben achim yafri. What about the beginning part of that pasuk? Amarava. Okay, what does it mean yafri here? So Amarava afilu shufta bekupina gemara rafia. It even causes the handle that's in the hole of the hoe to fall out. In other words, it's this. It'll cause yafri, instead of to be fruitful, it actually means to kind of destroy, like para is wild, right? It causes things to get messed up. So even something like that, like the wooden handle of this hoe is going to fall out of its place. Rav Yosef amar afilu sikta b'dachna rafia. It even takes a peg that's in the wall and that will fall out. Rav Acha bar Yaakov amar afilu kanya b'kufta rafia. Even reed in a wicker basket will fall out of its place. And with that, Hadran al kol haget, we finish the chapter. It's a very strange way to finish a chapter. I don't have a lot to say about this. I just have a few thoughts that came into my head, which is, first of all, the whole chapter, or at least a part of the chapter. You can go back how far to remember where it started, but we had a lot of things about, are people presumed alive, presumed dead? And then we're talking about all these things that might cause death, or, kind of things to turn sour, about, weather issues, and talking about how maybe there's some, and whether the weather issues are controlled by God, and, maybe there's something, some connection here between these ideas. Anyway, it requires some thought. You have Shabbat to think about it, and I'll just do a quick review of our daf, and then we'll finish for today. So we started with the maaser issue. Can you take teruma maaser for the Levite? We proved it from a pasuk where Abba Elazar ben Gamla gets it from. Seems it is a source of debate, but he holds yes. Then we had the fruits that you put aside, and you don't have to worry that they got destroyed. The money, you don't have to worry it's lost. But if you find it's lost or destroyed, then you have to go back 24 hours. Although we showed that the rabbis disagreed and actually said you have to go all the way back to the beginning. We proved that from the mikveh Mishnah that was missing water. And then we had what 24 hours is. Do you go all the way back in only 24 hours? You can assume it was good for 24 hours, or do we say we only assume it rotted 24 hours before? And we kind of proved that it was really 24 hours. Just go back 24 hours and you have to go all the way back to 24 hours from the beginning. Then we get to the 3 times of the year that the wine is likely to rot, which is connected to that in that Mishnah there, because you have to, then the wine really needs to be checked before you do teruma maaser on it. And then we talked about 3 times a year where you can sell things for higher price, and know you'll get a higher price, which was relevant to partnerships and how much you have to confer before you sell with your partner. And then we had all these statements about this east wind, and then also we learned about the north and the south wind, and what these winds bring along with them, and the dangers, and how they, how the world is sustained despite all these winds that come and dangers that come our way. Which again, similar to this idea of the people maybe on their deathbed or worrying that maybe they'll be killed and all sorts of things. Anyway, and also don't forget to read about Geneiva on Shuli's article for this week. Wishing everybody a Shabbat Shalom. And we'll meet up. You'll hear Shabbat Shiur tomorrow, and we'll meet up on Sunday. Have a great day, everyone.